Today we'll be testing the Radeon 6600 XT in Cyberpunk. So for those of you who've watched my previous video, I know I included Cyberpunk in my 8-game benchmark with this GPU. There we only had one or two settings and one resolution. So today we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, multiple settings, ray tracing, FSR, etc. Right, so if you have a look at the top left-hand corner there, we've got our performance metrics. You'll see that we are pairing this GPU with a 12400F Intel CPU, which is a 6-core, 12-thread, 12th gen CPU. And we've got 3200 MHz CL16 DDR4 memory. And you can see that we've got the frame rate, the average, the 1% lows, the 0.1% lows, as well as the frame time graph. Now, the reason why I include the frame time graph is because it will indicate when there are stutters. Alright, so let me just reset the numbers here, and what we'll be doing is we'll be running around the circle here. It's just outside of Mega Building H10, outside of V's starting apartment, and this is a pretty intensive area on both the CPU and GPU. Currently we're running at 1080p, and we've got the low preset with crowd density set to medium. All right, so that just happened again. Cyberpunk 2077 strikes again. Right, so we're going to be running around here. I just want to show you my graphical settings here. You'll see that it shows custom because if you choose the low preset, FSR is already enabled. So I just disable FSR, and that's pretty much it. Right, we have to reset the numbers again, and we just do a few circles of this, or a few laps of the circle, and then we'll drive around a little bit and see how it goes. So you can see we are a little bit CPU bottlenecked here. Our GPU usage is not peaked at 99%. It drops down into the 60s every now and again. I saw that crowd density actually helps with that. If we lower the crowd density, the CPU usage reduces and the GPU usage increases. All right, but so far we're not doing too bad. We've got an average of 104 frames per second with our 1% and 0.1% lows pretty much close to each other. It's a little bit low when compared to the average, but let's see if that evens out whilst we are running around a little bit. Now, I also make this video because there's quite a few things that I have to say about the 6600 XT from Radeon, and I could not get all of that in my previous video. So first off, I actually named it one of the best 1080p gaming GPUs in my previous video, and the reason for that is the price that I got it for. I paid about $200 for this one second hand, and anything close to the performance tier, a 3060 or 3060 Ti, was at least $50 to $60 more. Now, sure, with the 3060 you get DLSS and better ray tracing, but personally for these mid-tier cards, it's not worth it to enable ray tracing. It's nice to have, and if you really want to, you can probably play Cyberpunk with ray tracing at 30 frames per second, but that to me personally takes away a little bit from the game, and I'd prefer to play this game at 60 frames per second. Now, another reason why you would maybe consider the 3060 or 3060 Ti above the 6600 XT is due to the 6600 XT's 128-bit memory bus. At 1080p it doesn't really make that big a difference, but once you increase the resolution, the other cards start to run away a little bit, especially even the RX 5700 XT, which is the previous gen, and at 1080p the 6600 and the 5700, both XT models, they perform similarly, but once you start increasing the resolution, the 5700 XT actually beats the 6600 XT in more games than not. Alright, that's going to be it for our 1080p low. We've got an average of 104 frames per second, 1% lows of 61 and 0.1% lows of 46. Now we're going to try the medium preset. Alright, we've got the medium preset here, and once again you'll see that it tries to enable FSR, so we'll just disable FSR, and we'll just reset our numbers here. Now we dropped quite a few frames here. We went from about 100 average to, well, so far it's about 74. once again, the crowd density actually makes a pretty big difference. Previously in my testing, when I tested on low, as well as in the previous video, we got very decent frame rates with this GPU, a little bit higher than what we are getting now. Another thing that you need to consider when purchasing the 6600 XT is that it only has 8 PCIe Express lanes. Right, it looks like it's a full 16x slot, but only 8 of the pins are connected. So that means that if you have a PCIe Gen 4 system, you won't have any issues with that. There's no performance loss by using only 8 lanes. Remember, 8 PCIe Gen 4 lanes are equivalent to 16 PCIe Gen 3 lanes, so you'd get more or less the same performance as with the 16 lane Gen 3 card. But if you only have a PCIe Gen 3 system, you can expect about a 5 to 7% performance penalty when using this GPU. So then why would I recommend this GPU for 1080p gaming? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it will depend on the price. In my region, I stay in South Africa, it was actually the much cheaper option. I could get the 5700 XT at more or less the same price, and I don't think it's worth it because the 5700 XT is a few years older, and this card does support ray tracing. So even though I don't recommend you play with ray tracing enabled, you can enable ray tracing and take a few decent looking screenshots. And there are some games that'll definitely still work with the ray tracing. Control is one of them where the ray tracing implementation is actually very well done, and you also have FSR if you really want to enable ray tracing. Alright, so there we have it. We've got an average of 73 frames per second, 1% lows of 58 and 0.1% lows of 49. Now that's about a 30% decrease in our frame rate just by going from low to medium. Well, let's see the high preset. Alright, once again, the high preset, disabling FSR, and now we're getting about 60 frames per second. As I said, well, sorry, we're getting above 60 frames per second, that's what I wanted to say. Cyberpunk is also not one of the fastest paced first-person shooters, and therefore 60 frames per second is perfect for this game. It's also still one of the best looking games you can get. That was a pretty big stutter there, but that's just a auto save. I'm just going to reset the numbers there. Okay, I accidentally killed someone. So we got into a firefight here. Well, I'm just driving, but still the frame rate is maintaining 60 frames per second, and that's pretty good. I mean, we are at 1080p high with no FSR, and Cyberpunk, as I said, is still one of the best looking games out there, and it's one of the most demanding games out there at the moment still, and this is a pretty good experience. I would recommend this. Alright, but I'm going to have to reload my save now, but we got an average of 61 frames per second, 1% lows of 49 and 0.1% lows of 44. Right, so I just noticed something. In my previous video on 1080p high, we got a frame rate between 90 and 100 frames per second, and now we got an average of 69. Now, that was a little bit strange to me because we are playing on exactly the same settings. As you can see, we've got, it's a custom preset, but what we did was we selected the high preset and FSR disabled, right? And you can see here that now all of a sudden we're getting 90 frames per second, and this is what we saw with our previous video as well. And now I feel like I misled you in the previous video because obviously this FSR bug manifested itself in my previous run. Now it does show that FSR is turned off, but to really turn it off, you need to enable it, press apply, and then disable it, press apply again. And now you'll see we are getting in the 70s. So this is what the previous benchmark run or the previous video should have actually shown. Sorry about that. But well, at least now you can see what this card can really do at 1080p high with FSR disabled. Alright, now we need to test the Ultra preset. I'm going to make a few changes here just to make sure that FSR stays disabled. So I'm going to just apply that, then we'll apply it again, and then we'll apply it again. And technically it should now be applied. Alright, so We are still getting above 60 frames per second here. It will drop below 60 more often than on the previous preset. That's to be expected. But playing on a high refresh rate monitor, the frame rate currently still feels okay. Driving the input latency is not bad. So what we'll do is we'll get out and we'll try and fight a little bit. Still, the input latency feels okay. Remember, the driving in the game is a lot more intensive than just walking around. We gained about 10 frames per second just by getting out of the car. But let's see how the input latency holds up. So far, it's okay. I mean, here we go again. All right, that's annoying. So, once again, same guy. I mean, let me just get out of the way here. The input latency feels okay. I mean, we are still getting 60 frames per second most of the time here. It's starting to drop a little bit because there's a lot of action on the screen now. So I think if you want to play on quality, you still can, but maybe consider using FSR just to make sure that you get an above 60 frames per second experience all the time. I'm going to reload my save, and then we'll enable FSR on the Ultra preset, and let's see what the performance is like. Alright, so now we're on the Ultra preset. I'm not going to disable FSR this time. We're going to leave it on quality to see if we can get an above 60 frames per second at all times. And it looks good from the start here. We are getting between 70 and 80 frames per second. It's a little bit more blurry now, a little bit more pixelated. One thing that I can show you when I talk about the lights, you can see there that the artifacting in the lighting is a little bit worse at when you start using upscaling tech. This is true for DLSS as well. DLSS might be a little bit less noticeable, but it's still there. Right, so this is what the game is like at 1080p on the Ultra preset. It's more than playable. This is still a very good looking game, and now it just feels a little bit more responsive than on the previous preset. I'm not the biggest fan of using upscaling tech on 1080p resolution, but if you really have to, you can enable the Ultra preset. It looks good. I'm not sure if there's that big a difference between high and Ultra, so my recommendation would be to use 1080p on high, disable FSR. You'll get a full 60 frames per second experience most of the time, and the game would just look so much better. Alright, let's see what we can do at 1440p. So at 1440p, I'm going to use the medium preset and disable FSR. This time I'm going to make sure that FSR is definitely disabled, doing that a few times. And now we're at 1440p native with the medium preset. Let's just reset our numbers here. And you can see we're getting around 50 frames per second. The game looks a whole lot better at 1440p. This is a very crisp looking game at this resolution. It's very enjoyable at this resolution, and it's definitely very playable at this resolution. As I said, it's currently connected to a high refresh rate panel, 144 Hz, but the panel that I'm using actually supports AMD FreeSync, and that's enabled currently. You might see some tearing in the recording, but there's no tearing whatsoever on the screen because of that, and it feels great. I mean, it feels a lot faster than 50 frames per second, and there's a very easy way to actually fix it. If you're not happy seeing 50 frames per second, just disable your frame rate counter and you'll be none the wiser. Alright, you actually will feel it a little bit in the input latency. There's not that big a difference when you drop down from say 60 to 55, but once you start hitting 45 frames per second, you really do feel the increase in the input latency. Alright, but this was at 1440p medium native resolution, we got an average of 53 frames per second, 1% lows of 41 and 0.1% lows of 34. I'm just going to enable FSR. I think we should be able to get about 65 frames per second average with FSR, and the game would look pretty good still, because then it would be upscaling from 1080p to 1440p, so it would look better than a 1080p, but just slightly worse than 1440p. So for that, I'm just going to enable the medium preset, because FSR is then enabled by default. I think it should enable the quality preset. Actually, looking at the frame rate, I don't think it's the quality FSR preset. We almost doubled our frame rate here. That's interesting. So it might be on performance or balanced, not sure, but you can see quite a bit of shimmering there in the distance where my crosshair is. If we zoom in, it disappears. Those lights on that building there, there's quite a bit of shimmering. Right, so let's see if we just enable FSR quality for this, if we still get 60 frames per second. And I think we should. The shimmering is unfortunately still present, but now we're getting 75 frames per second, give or take. And the game looks good, because now we are rendering internally at 1080p, then upscaling to 1440p, and it looks pretty good. The frame rate here is pretty good as well. As I said, with a 3060 Ti or even a 5700 XT, you will get a little bit better performance at higher resolutions. So I'm just testing these resolutions to give you an idea. If you actually buy this card, I mean, $200 is still a lot of money. You would expect a $200 card to be able to play some games at 1440p, and I'm just showing you that you definitely still can. Alright, so now it's time to move on to 4K. Alright, we're now at 4K. I'm going to use the exact same graphical settings, which is the medium preset, but just with the quality FSR. And we drop down into the 30s here. Now this is definitely not a 4K card, but it's 4K capable, depending on your expectations. If you want a 4K 30 FPS experience, you can definitely have one, albeit with FSR quality. I think if we enable FSR Ultra Performance, it renders again at 1080p, I believe, or maybe even one lower. Then we should definitely still get 60 frames per second, right? But 4K with upscaling is not true 4K, unpopular opinion. This is definitely still not bad. I mean, we are rendering at 1440p, then upscaling to 4K. It's better than I expected, especially considering our limited memory bus and also our limited 8 gig VRAM. You can see we're not using our full 8 gigs of VRAM just yet, and that's because we are rendering at a lower internal resolution, and this is the medium preset, right? I'm not sure if we'd be able to get Cyberpunk to fully saturate 8 gigs of VRAM. I haven't been able to do that yet, not even with ray tracing enabled, so I think it should be fine if you want to crank up the settings at 4K. Alright, let's see if we up the FSR a bit. I'm going to set it to performance. Let's see if we can get 60 frames per second. Alright, we're on FSR Performance, still the medium preset. Let's reset our numbers here. And so this is pretty much the same as what we got at 1440p. So it seems that performance then upscales from 1440p. Would that be correct? I don't know the resolution scaling table off the top of my head. I was actually pretty sure that FSR Quality rendered at 1440p when at 4K. I could be mistaken. So still not a 60 frames per second experience here. It's a playable experience. I wouldn't mind playing like this. The graphics still look crisp. The text looks crisp. And let's see what driving is like. I expect we'll drop into the 40s here. And there we go. It's a little bit more intensive driving because obviously the map needs to load assets a little bit faster than when you are walking or running. And I mean, it's still not bad. I mean, this card was never designed to play at 4K. It's just nice that with the AMD's FSR that you can actually still game at 4K with a mid to low tier GPU. All right, that's enough for 4K. Now we need to test ray tracing. I'm not going to do many ray tracing tests. We'll just do ray tracing at 1080p because unfortunately with RDNA 2, it was AMD's first iteration of ray tracing, and it wasn't the best. And this is still a budget GPU, so the hardware ray tracing accelerators are even more cut down, so we really can't expect too much once we start enabling ray tracing, but let's see what it's like. Right, so we're back at 1080p and we are first going to try the ray tracing low preset. FSR is set to auto. I'm just going to put that to quality just to keep it consistent, and all this post-processing effects are still on. I don't like to play with this on, but for now I'll just leave it on for the benchmark. You can see ray tracing is on, so that's just to be able to enable all the settings below it, and with the low preset you'll see that only local shadows are enabled. All right, and you can see that we are now not even getting 60 frames per second even when utilizing FSR, and this is now only with local shadows. There's no ray traced lighting or reflections, so I mean we can up the FSR scaling a bit. We can go up to maybe balanced or performance, but once again you need to decide for yourself whether ray tracing is actually worth the performance. And just to let you know, I've got a 3080 in my personal gaming rig. I never enable ray tracing except when I do benchmarks. I literally just crashed into the back of this guy and now I'm being fired upon. Right, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable ray traced reflections, because that actually causes one of the biggest performance hits. Well, even here in the tunnel you can see we're dropping into the 40s. So let's see what ray traced reflections do for us. Right, so now we're just enabling ray traced reflections here, and I can immediately feel a pretty big slowdown. Well, you can actually see in the car the reflections are a little bit more accurate. Well, a lot more accurate. It's actually being reflected what's behind you. The same as with the Spider-Man. So I mean the ray traced reflections look great, but do you really notice it when you just play the game? I notice it when I stand still and I look at it, but other than that, driving around shooting people, like ray traced reflections personally to me once again is just not worth the performance. Right, I'm just going to enable ray traced lighting as well. Then we'll have most of the ray traced settings enabled, and that'll give you a good indication of what performance you can expect from this GPU with ray tracing as well. Right, so we'll just the only setting, or the lowest setting you can use, is medium. So we'll do ray trace lighting on medium. Right, let's reset the numbers there, and now we are getting a pretty solid 30 frames per second. And now the input latency is pretty bad. I'm struggling to drive. The responsiveness is out the window, and it's not worth it. That's my opinion. I think a lot of people share my sentiment here. Ray tracing, especially on budget GPUs, not worth it. It's great for taking screenshots, but then what you do is you go back to your normal 1080p medium or 1080p high preset and enjoy the game for what it's supposed to be. Remember, we are using FSR still, and it is noticeable, especially on the car roof reflections. It's pretty grainy even with ray trace reflections enabled. That's just due to FSR, and they destroyed my car, so I'm probably gonna die here. Alright, but that's it for this video. So my recommendation would be, if you've got an RX 6600 XT, play on 1080p medium or 1080p high. If you really want, you can play at 1440p with FSR. It's definitely still capable, but native resolution 60 frames per second 1080p high is the way to go. Alright, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.